I wonder if I can start by taking you back to those whirlwind days in May. I remember it very clearly because it was one of those classic, those who know what's going on aren't speaking and those who are speaking don't know what's going on. And I remember that very clearly because I was speaking all of the time on College Green about what I thought would happen. It turned out that my guesstimate proved right, that there would be a full-blown coalition between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. But how well prepared were you for that? I mean, talk me through. You sort of get back at 3 o'clock in the morning from your count at Yeovil. You're re-elected. It's evident we're heading for a hung parliament. How well prepared were the Liberal Democrats, and sort of what happened next? How did those negotiations get underway?
I think that the Lib Dems were reasonably well prepared in this election for the possibility of coalition. I mean, firstly, it was obvious that this was quite a likely outcome of the general election, and we'd certainly had plenty of practice for 30 or 40 years of preparing for hung parliaments without anything coming of it. But on this occasion, we'd also, I think, got a more coalition-friendly manifesto. We'd thought ahead about a lot of the policy issues and implementation issues, I think, more carefully than in the past. And we'd had the experience, both in Scotland and Wales, of forming coalition governments and dealing with all of the difficulties that are associated with that process. And I think that we learnt quite a lot from Scotland and Wales and avoided many of the pitfalls. And I think also it's fair to say that we were served up with a set of circumstances which were relatively favourable in both constraining our choices, but also giving us plausibly the ability to deal with both other parties.
You mean it was really only arithmetically possible to form a government with the Conservatives?
It always looked incredibly difficult to contemplate having anything other than a Conservative Lib Dem coalition if we had a coalition government. I mean, the numbers with Labour, as you know, never quite stacked up. We would have had some horrendous coalition type arrangement with minority parties where every single vote, frankly, in the House of Commons would have been very difficult, where we would have been buying off all the nationalist parties on every single vote, where we would have been held to ransom by backbench MPs of both of our parties. But there was enough, I suppose, daylight for the possibility of there being some type of arrangement between Labour and the Liberal Democrats that we still had some negotiating leverage.
And how well prepared did you find your Conservative counterparts and your Labour counterparts across the negotiating table?
I mean, the Conservatives were incredibly well prepared, I think, and they
were expecting not to win the election, you suspect?
Well, I don't know whether they were expecting not to win, but they had certainly got a serious negotiating strategy. They certainly knew what the key issues were for us. They certainly had a very clear sense of what their key issues were. I think that they found it maybe easier to deal with us because we were both opposition parties, therefore coming to the table with a similar sense of not having been in government, and therefore we didn't have, I think, a lot of the baggage you have when you're negotiating with a smaller party having effectively lost power. And when you've been in power, it's difficult to start compromising on policies that you've been involved in implementing. And they had a very different style to the style that I recognise from Labour in Scotland and Wales, and certainly in these negotiations. I mean, the Labour style seems to be never to give away anything at all, to show no negotiating flexibility whatsoever until 1 minute to midnight, or sometimes 1 minute past midnight. And actually, one of the things that made it easier for ourselves and the Conservatives is that both sides recognised pretty quickly what each other's bottom lines were and moved almost, on day one to the bottom line of the negotiations on all of the key points. And it was only really the issue of voting reform that was particularly an impediment early on, and that took some negotiation.
Can I ask you a bit, because deficit reduction kind of formed the centrepiece, really, of, we've got to get together, there's a potential national emergency, the public finances have got to be got under control, etc. You famously referred to the note that Liam Byrne left you, sorry, Chief Secretary, there's no money left. How did the coalition negotiations sort of focus on that overarching strategic theme so quickly? There'd been virtually no mention of it during the general election.
Well, I wouldn't say no mention of it. I mean, it had been a huge issue overhanging the general election. Of course, the economic pressures had only got much more significant during the general election, in that there was chaos, the beginnings of chaos in many of the Mediterranean countries and their economies. We saw bond yields in Greece leap by many percentage points, even in the period March, April, May. So the tensions and the price of not having a credible deficit reduction strategy were increasing during that period of time. And we always recognised that if there was a coalition government, and one that we were involved in, it would enormously increase market scepticism about whether there could be a credible deficit reduction plan. There would be huge pressure on the government to show that it could deliver. And it certainly wasn't in either the country's interests or in our interests for it to be seen that because of the fact that there was a coalition that we were part of, there was a loss of confidence in the financial markets. So we were very clear from early on that we needed to send out a signal that deficit reduction would be taken.
I suppose I'm asking a bit of a question. That this isn't a uniquely a criticism of the Liberal Democrats, more about the sort of democratic legitimacy of this. I mean, it seemed to me, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, that the sort of story being told by Nick Clegg was, we've suddenly found a whole load of invoices stuffed behind the sofa. The system, the whole situation is far worse now on the morning of Friday, May the 6th, than we had anticipated in our manifesto, which we put to the electorate a month earlier. The Liberal Democrat manifesto, I think, identified £15 billion worth of savings. I mean, a drop in the ocean compared to the comprehensive spending review. Same's true of the Conservatives and the Labour Party. We went through this whole process in which I would have thought that anybody who had picked up a copy of City AM or the Financial Times would know that any incoming government was going to have to grapple with this problem extremely seriously, despite sort of dancing some dance of the seven veils throughout the election campaign. Do you think there's any validity in that criticism, that mainstream politicians didn't really address the point about cutting public spending and getting under control in the run-up to polling day?
I think there was a lot of acknowledgement by all of the parties that this would be the big challenge for the next Parliament, and certainly Nick Clegg and Vince Cable made very clear that they didn't believe that the Labour deficit reduction plan was credible, in many respects that it didn't go far enough. There was then this argument, which dominated the general election campaign, or parts of it, about whether to have cuts in 2010, 2011. Actually, that was a very small issue compared with the scale of deficit reduction that was going to be necessary. And actually, even if we cut 5 or 6 billion in 2010, 2011, that was very small in the context of the total economy. And most of the deficit reduction package has still been from 2011 onwards. What was particularly critical, I think, in 2010 was that there were two reasons for the markets to test any new incoming government. The first was the very fact that it was going to be a coalition, and therefore there were bound to be doubts about whether we could deliver on deficit reduction, which made it important, I think, to have some initial clear indication that this would be a government that was credible in that area. And the second thing, quite honestly, is that the situation had got much, much worse over the period March, April, May. You only have to look at what had happened to bond yields in the Mediterranean countries, particularly Greece, to see what was going on. And there was real nervousness during the negotiations on the part of the Bank of England and on the part of the Treasury about what would happen if there was no clear, strong majority government. I mean, there was a real concern, I think, that we might end up facing...
Which would have made, say, confidence and supply an extremely... This arrangement where the Liberal Democrats would sit on the opposition benches but give some assistance to a minority Conservative government. You thought that that would not be credible on the markets?
It wouldn't have been very credible, and I think everybody would have known, and this was our assumption before the general election and during the negotiations, that if there was a confidence and supply arrangement and there was no coalition, then there would be a second general election in the autumn, and the period from May to the autumn general election would be one of manoeuvring by both of the parties to fight that general election on the most favourable possible terms, blaming the other for whatever the problem was that we were facing.
And on having now gone into coalition, I mean, you sort of say, well, if you like, to some degree, at last, after 30 years or what it was, this arithmetical fluke came up that the sort of Liberal Party, the Alliance, the Liberal Democrats have always prepared for this, and then suddenly the cards have fallen in this direction. I mean, I know to my considerable professional cost that any discussion of what might happen in a hung parliament scenario, absolutely toxic. The line to be stuck to is the maximum number of votes. We hope to form a government outright ourselves. Hung parliament's deeply unlikely. It's going to be clear what the electorate's verdict is. That's for the birds now, isn't it? The Liberal Democrats can't possibly run that line again at any future election.
Well, I hope what we'll run is actually the remarkably effective line that Nick used throughout the campaign. I mean, there was a lot of discussion before the general election of how do we get out of this position of fighting the whole general election, being asked whether we would do a deal with the Conservatives or Labour, which is the worst possible environment, as you know very well if you're a Liberal Democrat, because you're defined in other people's terms and you risk upsetting whichever group of voters are aligned, potentially more closely aligned to the other party. And there was discussion before the election campaign of, do we rule out the possibility of Gordon Brown being the Prime Minister? What other mechanisms do we use to have some greater degree of independence, or to remove the risk that people think that we're going to put Gordon Brown back in when he's very unpopular? And actually, after much consideration, the strategy that Nick favoured most was simply the strategy of saying, we will talk first to the party with the largest number of votes and MPs. And that gave us not only a sensible strategy of dealing with the post-election scenario, but it also gave us a very good line for implying that the decisions after the general election were more the public's than ours. And actually, many of the press, who know that they can only ask those questions so many times before
got bored of it.
They get bored, were willing to get bored and move on.
Having gone into coalition and going into sort of your position on the political spectrum, something both you and I think have suffered from. Everybody sort of says David Laws, he's basically a Tory with a yellow rosette. I've told a lot of people in this room that on the eve of the last general election there was a knock on my door, and I opened the door and there was a young lady standing there with a blue rosette, and she said, "Mr. Littlewood," and I said, "Yes." She says, I've got you down as a possible Conservative," and I said, "Yes, so do my former employers, actually." What in terms of the differences between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats in the coalition, do you think those have sort of narrowed enormously since you entered politics? I mean, if I look back 15, 20 years, the Conservative Party was pretty authoritarian on a whole range of issues. Section 28, no question of sort of hugging a hoodie or anything like that. Now under Cameron, are those differences actually narrowed enormously? If you were entering politics to now, would you actually think, well, the Conservative Party's liberal enough?
No, I think the reasons for being a Liberal Democrat rather than Labour or Conservative are still pretty clear, and it's still pretty much what they were when I went into politics. But I think you're right, obviously, that the Conservative Party is much less authoritarian, that David Cameron's leadership has been the first leadership that has really moved the Conservatives on in terms of what I would call personal liberalism. It's a generational thing, I think. And also, obviously, compared with when I was young and first getting interested in politics, the whole scope, the whole range and breadth of politics has narrowed in. I mean, you don't have the same extremes, particularly on the left, and that nobody's really making the case for fully fledged socialism. But to me, it is still the case that the Labour Party is a party of compassion and social justice, but lack of credibility on the economy and on economic liberalism. The Conservative Party, since Mrs Thatcher, is pretty much an economically liberal party, but not so strong on what I would call the sort of social justice and opportunity.
And you don't think Cameron's addressed that and solved it? I mean, what would you like to see Cameron do in these areas that he hasn't?
Well, I mean, one very striking example from the 2010 election, I think, was putting inheritance tax cuts as the top tax policy priority of the Conservative Party that they were really associated with, whereas our priority was taking people on low and middle incomes out of tax. And that's a very obvious prioritisation of low and middle income Britain rather than the people who would have gained from the inheritance tax cuts at the top end of the scale. So I think that the Conservative Party, and this is something for them to worry about, not for us to worry about, we've got enough problems dealing with our own policy issues, but it seems to me that there is still some way to run on the issues relating to what I call social liberalism, which are the social justice issues. And I think that the Liberal Democrats are a party which, at our best, have the best chance of fusing economic and social liberalism.
But some of the things that the electorate might associate the Liberal Democrats with as distinct from the Conservatives were swiftly thrown out of the window. And I think the scars from the tuition fees change of tack are still there. I remember speaking to one, I won't say who it was, one newly elected Lib Dem MP. He said, I don't know what to do now, because actually looking at all of the facts, I should vote with the government and not rebel. And looking back on it, I think I made an extremely stupid promise, and now the moral challenge is whether you should keep your extremely stupid promises or break your extremely stupid promises. But in electoral terms, don't you think that it's not these sort of philosophical distinctions about fairness that really motivate people to vote Liberal Democrat or Conservative? Tuition fees was an enormous issue that the Liberal Democrats were associated on, a ludicrous policy from my own point of view. And that's been jettisoned. Do you think the electorate are now sort of, that would have been a clear thing that the electorate would have said about the Liberal Democrats? They're in favour of abolishing tuition fees. Gone. And so do you think the distinctions that the electorate make about policies are even fuzzier and now closer together between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, and even as you conceive that there's a narrowing of the gap between the two?
And obviously when you go into coalition and you have to make compromises, it's bound to be the case that in some areas of your identity you lose identity, particularly if you're the smaller party. That's the evidence of most coalitions throughout the European Union. But I still think that most people in the country have, and even if they couldn't name the top 10 Lib Dem policies, or for that matter Conservative or Labour policies, they still have a gut instinct about what they think the three parties stand for. And I think that Labour are well-intentioned but not very good on the economy. I think they think the Conservatives are very credible on the economy and good at sort of sorting out tough issues, but are not as compassionate as they would like to see. And I think that they think that the Lib Dems are more sensible on economics than the Labour Party and more compassionate than the Conservative Party, and are good on some other issues like green issues and personal freedoms.
I think, is Max Lind in the room somewhere? I don't know if he's made it. I'll read out his question. Seeing how the alternative vote referendum failed in its attempt to reform the electoral system of the House of Commons, seeing how deeply separated the Conservative and Liberal parties were in their opposition and support for AV, and seeing how parliamentary reform has long been one of the most cherished flagship policies of the Liberal Democrats, do you believe your party now has a chance to evolve into something a bit more like the German Free Democrats and continue to be a natural coalition partner of the Conservatives in future parliaments?
Well, I think we had some discussion about that issue during the coalition talks, where there were some comments being made by Chris Huhne and Vince and Nick Clegg in one particular meeting, and somebody was saying, we may become like the FDP, and somebody else very quickly butted in and said, well, I hope it'll be a large FDP, because the problem with them sometimes is they're rather low in the polls, and we want
the Liberal Democrats.
We want not only to be a major part of British politics, but we want to be a major part of British politics on 20 or 25%, not on 5%. So I'm not sure that is the perfect model that I would aspire to.
Well, the FDP, but 2 or 3 times the size. That would be the perfect model you'd aspire to, would it?
I would aspire to a situation where the Liberal Democrats have got real influence in British politics and are able to get some of our manifesto implemented, in contrast to the last 60, 70, 80 years. But I think that we want to be a major force in British politics at a Westminster level. We don't want to be some tiny little statistical aberration hoping for what you described earlier on as a sort of statistical accident every 50 years. And actually the truth is that although there was an element of this general election turning up a result that we'd waited for a long period of time, that obviously wasn't just some sort of accident. It was also partly a consequence of the fact that we have become a much larger party at Westminster.
A bigger bloc. The bigger the Liberal bloc, the more likely. The bigger
the Liberal bloc, the more likelihood that you end up in that position of influence.
Let's move on to policy rather than politics. And I want to challenge you on the extent to which the Liberal Democrats deserve the first part of their name. The Liberal part of their name. And of course, you were already relatively famous at the time, but you rose to fame to some extent through the Orange Book, which actually has a remarkable book. I mean, the content's not bad, but what's actually remarkable about it is I think this is the only book in my lifetime published on politics, which is now more expensive on Amazon and eBay than at the point of it was printed. It was going for £8.99. They're about £12 to buy off eBay now. So that was a fairly big success.
That may be because of Chris Renard. When we first published this,
he just bought them and torched them.
I said how well they were selling, and he said that it was him buying them and storing them in his garage to people from reading them.
But what a great practice of economic genuine liberalism that is. In terms of the economic liberalism issue for the party, what frustrated me when I was working for the party is it just seemed year on year, this may have changed now, but basically whatever the size of the state was as a proportion of GDP, the Liberal Democrats wanted it to be just slightly bigger than that. A penny on income tax for education, or in the 2005 general election, the 50p rate, that will raise this amount of money. So whatever the level was, was. There was never an enormous sort of leap up, let's double public spending, but it was always in that upwards direction. I've always said that it seems to me that Liberal Democrat activists can't set eyes on a post office, a hospital or a library without wanting to save it, and run petitions to save it. So to what extent are you comfortable in a party that has historically, frankly, advocated edging up the size of the state compared to whatever it's actually grown to? I mean, I get screamed at for being an extreme right-winger if I'm only advocating sort of, let's return to the levels of public spending of 5 years ago.
I think if we're fair to the party and look back over the last 20 or so years, there have been quite significant changes in our position on that issue as the facts and the circumstances have changed. I mean, in the 1990s, when we had quite a squeeze on public spending, we were arguing the case for additional spending supplemented by tax hikes in order to tackle areas such as education and health where there was underinvestment, in inverted commas. And then there was a period where Gordon Brown started spending so much money that actually it became impossible to outbid him. And it was difficult to get out of that outbidding process, because we'd only just, after repeating the message for about 10 or 15 years, got people to remember that the 1p on tax policy, as one of the Lib Dem policies. And there were people in the party, as you know, who said, even though it may make sense to get rid of this economically, do we really want to get rid of something that people associate with us and has generally been popular? But we did do, because we knew that it would be a nonsense to keep on repeating that as public spending went through the roof. And we did then move to a position where we said we're not arguing for higher public spending. We started to move in favour of reducing the burden of tax for people on middle and low incomes. And we're now in a process where we're saying that we're going to cut public spending quite significantly over the spending review period. So I think we have been more pragmatic than your analysis might allow for.
But do you think the party accepts the post-Thatcherite consensus?
Well, it depends what the post-Thatcherite consensus is. I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by the post-Thatcherite.
Well, which of Margaret Thatcher's reforms would you, in retrospect, not have supported? Should we renationalise British Airways, for example?
No, I think that the party does accept both the changes in union law and the privatisation programme that took place. And I don't think that there is argument about those aspects of economic policy.
So are you in agreement or disagreement with the Liberal Democrat President, Tim Farron, who in April of this year, in the midst of the AV referendum, blamed Margaret Thatcher's, quote, wickedness on the current electoral system? He went on to clarify these comments by saying, I meant what I said. I certainly felt that. Thatcherism was morally bereft. It was about an assault on the industrial community. It was ideologically motivated, almost spiteful, against communities who were deemed to be the enemy within.
I'm not sure that's the language I would necessarily use myself.
I'm very glad to hear it.
But I do have to say that one of the reasons why many people felt very angry during the 80s and are still scarred by that is that there was, and I have a very kind of clear memory myself of the impression that period left on me, there was a sense that the Conservative Party had a very tough strategy to try to make the economy more effective and efficient, but that there wasn't a great deal of social compassion involved. And I think also, if you look purely at macroeconomic policy rather than the privatisation programme, there was a legitimate view that macroeconomic policy in the early 80s cut into the muscle of business and industry and not just into the fat. And obviously one of the problems with that recession in the 1980s is that it led not just to a distribution of pain fairly evenly across the country, or perhaps in the city in the south as the 1990s recession did, but it led to the closing down of whole industries.
We weren't all in it together.
We were not in it together, and there wasn't really a sense that we were in it together, and people didn't really feel that they had a government that was concerned enough about the social consequences of economic policy.
Is David Whittaker in the room? Otherwise I'll read out his question as well. David Whittaker, so the company he works for, which I think is Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and he currently works on the CT policy reform. I'd be interested to hear Mr. Lawes' views on the lowering of the CT rate and his general thoughts on the future of the UK economy, particularly on low-end corporation tax.
On the corporation tax rate. I mean, I think it's incredibly important for us to be competitive on corporation tax. I mean, there's no use in just looking at one single rate, because you have to take the corporation tax system as a whole, and it's sometimes tempting just to focus on one part of it and end up having additional burdens on business through other parts of the tax system. But increasingly we are going to be in a world economy where there's a great ability on the part of businesses to move around, where the developing countries that people would not have wanted to site production in the past for a series of very obvious reasons are going to be far more attractive. And therefore Britain has got to be a place where mobile industries want to site themselves, and we've got to be aware of that, even while we grapple with very difficult public finance.
Well, let's look at some of the other taxation issues then, and general economic issues that seem to be exercising the Liberal Democrats at the moment. One of the things I find completely bewildering, I can remember back to when Min Campbell was leader, and I was the head of press of the party. We sweated bullets, you were a key ally at the time, to get rid of the 50p tax policy. There was a full debate at party conference. The party ditched its commitment to a 50p rate of income tax. Lo and behold, suddenly now in government, this seems to be a sticking point for the Liberal Democrats, not even defending their own policy, which was reversed to drop the 50p rate. Where are you on the 50p rate?
I think our policy on the 50% rate hasn't changed in the same way as the Conservative policy on the 50p rate hasn't changed. Or, for that matter, I'm not sure what the Labour policy is on the 50p rate anymore, but certainly the policy when they introduced it was that it was a temporary measure, not something they wanted to see permanently. Our position on the 50p rate is not that it should be a permanent part of the tax system at all. I mean, I would like to see the 50% rate gone as soon as we can reasonably do so. But I think our position is to make that a priority at a time when we have a massive budget deficit and where we need to deliver tax reductions for people on low and middle incomes would be a very strange thing to do. We took a deliberate decision in the negotiations over the coalition that our first priority on tax would be delivery of the £10,000 allowance. And I would like that to be delivered as our first priority. I think. But is it an either or? I mean, how much to what extent would you or the Liberal Democrat Parliamentary Party be persuaded by the 50p rate being on the wrong side of the Laffer curve? If it actually turns out that George Osborne's Treasury Commissioned report comes back and says, you know what, this is losing us money, then it's not an either or. You can increase the income tax threshold and scrap the 50p rate. Is this actually about sensible economics, or is this just about political posturing? If somebody came back and produced some immaculate economic research, which was totally credible, which showed that we were actually losing revenue in the Treasury from having a 50% rate, then clearly it wouldn't be sensible to keep it. I would be absolutely staggered if that were to be the case, because as you know, it is very, very rare to put up the tax on something and actually get less revenue as a consequence. It is relatively rare. It is relatively common to put up tax and to discover that people use avoidance mechanisms, which means that the amount of revenue you get in is significantly less than the crude amount that you get in if everybody just paid up. And I'm sure we'll find that very intelligent people with good tax advisors find ways of avoiding a significant part of the 50% revenue yield. But I suspect that we'll find, and we'll have to wait for the full review to come in, I suspect we'll still find that it is a revenue raiser. And I would have to justify, as would every other coalition MP, going back to our constituents and saying that our priority in the current environment, which has been tough and is arguably even tougher at the moment because of the situation in the Eurozone, that we would be arguing then for reducing a tax that affects the top couple of percent of the population rather than people on the very bottom end or the middle of the income distribution.
But there would be a set of numbers that would persuade you could do both. And you intellectually would accept that there must be some top rate of income tax which is disadvantageous to revenue generation. And presumably you do agree that a top rate of 100% would have fairly substantial disincentive effects.
I think that's a reasonable assumption, but I think that I would be astonished, and I don't know of anybody serious who has argued this yet, if the 50% rate isn't raising some amount of revenue.
Of course, the difficult bit is to work out. It clearly will raise some amount of revenue. There are some people paying tax at a 50p rate. The difficult bit, with that's undeniably true. Some money is coming in on the 50p rate. The difficult bit to measure is what is its disincentive effects. Has anybody left the country rather than staying here? People move to New York. That's much harder to measure.
Yeah.
You will be able to easily measure on people's tax forms. This is the amount of income tax that has come in at the 50p rate, but it is much harder to measure the negative disincentive effects. I mean, some sort of guesstimate will have to be done there.
That's true, although the overwhelming amount of anecdotal evidence that I'm getting, and I admit it is only anecdotal and it must pass the same rigorous test that I mentioned earlier on, but the overwhelming amount of anecdotal evidence is that what people are really concerned about in the city and business is, will this tax last? How long is it going to last? I mean, most people who have very high incomes have a good degree of social responsibility. We shouldn't assume that they don't understand the difficult position that the government is in trying to eventually get rid of the 50% rate. And most of those that I've spoken to have said, look, we're pretty relaxed about this, provided, you know, it doesn't stay for a long period of time. If it did stay for a long period of time, or if people expected it to, then I think the economic consequences would be far more serious, and we would get decisions being taken over time to base activities, economic activities, abroad rather than in the UK. So I don't think that there is a hugely damaging economic impact, provided this tax doesn't hang around too long.
In terms of regulation, employment law, red tape and the like, Norman Lamb, who I thought was a sensible person on your wing of the party, was the first to leap in response to the Beecroft report, arguing that unfair dismissal should be scrapped as law, described such proposals as madness. I wonder what present restrictions on business, whether they're employment rights or any other issues, health and safety legislation, you name it, you think the Liberal Democrats do actually want to get rid of? And if I could just push you a bit further on this, in terms of red tape, regulation, the power of the state, in July of last year, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, it was reported by the BBC as overseeing the coalition government's political reform programme and deregulation programme. And he promised in May to create the biggest shake-up of the country's democracy since the Great Reform Act of 1832. How's that project going?
Well, are you asking about political reform or are you asking about regulation?
Both.
Well,
I mean,
on political reform, it's not going quite as well following the referendum. We have
deregulation, there, a bonfire of red tape was promised.
Well, I think Ed Davey in Biz is doing some incredibly important work there. I mean, he has taken a decision that was very unpopular with many members of the party to extend the period of time before you actually get protection as an employee in business, to double the 1 year to 2 years. And that, I think, deals with a very real and legitimate concern that many businesses had that was deterring them potentially from taking people on. I have to say that in terms of some of what's in Beecroft, and I'm not the world's expert on Beecroft, and there are bits of Beecroft which I'm told are very sensible, but in terms of the wider of the part of Beecroft that just says, you know, there is a real problem with getting rid of people at the moment, we need to make that process easier. I have to say that I don't see much sign of it being difficult for businesses to get rid of people at the moment. After all, we've just been through about the biggest process of quarterly shedding of labour in the public sector and the private sector that we've seen for decades. And I think, therefore, does it feel as if that issue is a particular problem at the moment? No, I don't think it does. And in other areas where there are legitimate issues and concerns in labour regulation, like the Working Time Directive, actually the party's been very pragmatic in saying that we should be looking at changing some of those things, and that there is unnecessary regulation coming in from the European Union that we want to amend to make sure that it is more liberal.
And in terms of political reform, I mean, that fox is shot now, isn't it? One of the Liberal Democrats' senior advisors said to me, in terms of political reform, referring to the AV referendum, Nick decided to put everything on red and it came up black.
Well, we decided to ask the public, with the agreement of our coalition partners, whether they wanted electoral reform, whether they wanted the alternative vote. They said no. I think we've got to respect that. I don't see us, given the scale of the vote against the AV system, going back, 6 months later or a year later, as if we're Ireland, with a slightly different question. I think actually one of the problems with AV is that although we thought that it was a modest reform that would be easier to sell not only to the other political parties but to the British people, our problem was that there was an assumption that we could just sell this as change, and any political change being a good thing in the environment that we're in. Actually, I think people found it much more difficult, voters found it much more difficult to understand how the AV system would work. Whereas actually, funnily enough, it would probably have been easier to sell to voters
a pure PR
system, because they would have understood instinctively what it was. And I suspect that if and when there is another referendum on electoral reform, it'll probably have to be on a different system from AV.
Again, to test the extent to which the Liberal Democrats deserve the word liberal, you mentioned on I think it was the eve of the Liberal Democrat conference this year. You said it's the Liberal Democrats have got should not be a brake on the coalition; they should be the engine of the coalition. So I want to turn to the subject of public services and look into whether or not you think that the Liberal Democrats are being the engine of public service reform or a brake on public service reform. I don't know if Dave Gibson's here. Dave, have you got a question?
I'm the Liberal Democrat who believes that adding competition to public services will always benefit with a greater result. Do you think that if the party leadership were to pursue that as an agenda, would that destroy the unity within the party?
No, not necessarily. And if you look at what we've supported in the area of schools, we've supported not only a lot more devolution of power to schools, but a more competitive system where there is more discretion on schools if they want to expand, where we've got free schools coming into the system, where we've got more choice within the education system. I think that we also have a job to do to make sure school reform works effectively, to ensure that in a system that has more freedom, there is also strong accountability. I believe very passionately as a principle in choice and competition as a Liberal and a Liberal Democrat, and I think that those principles will lead to improvements in public services. But I don't necessarily think that in all parts of the country competition and choice will be a cure-all. I mean, in many rural areas, there is effectively, particularly in terms of secondary education, often one major catchment school. It will be a long time before the Free Schools programme has made a difference in those particular areas. There are huge barriers to entry in terms of setting up new schools. And I think if we're to get the schools reform programme right, which is, to me, the second most important thing that the government is doing after sorting out the economy, and which I think Michael Gove and Sarah Tether incidentally are doing a fantastic job on. But I think actually we need to make sure that in driving reform, we've not only got choice and competition, but that we've got a strong and actually rather stronger accountability mechanism to make sure that competition and choice are complemented by strong accountability, so that in the areas where actually competition and choice is not very effective as a driver of school improvement, we don't allow some of those schools simply to coast along, failing many generations of youngsters.
But I'm just trying to work out whether you really think your parliamentary colleagues here are putting forward a liberal agenda or just acting as a brake. I mean, you argue in this book that there should be a radical reform of UK health services to introduce greater choice, going well beyond New Labour's proposals to replace the National Health Service with a scheme of national health insurance. Andrew George, your parliamentary colleague, says about the rather more modest Lansley proposals, there's an underlying unease about the bill amongst my colleagues. Although I knew I was not alone, I hadn't anticipated a rebellion on this scale. Liberal Democrats were the architects of the National Health Service and do not want to become the architects of its demise. I assume that you would consider that what you were proposing in that book to be its demise. I mean,
No, I wouldn't describe that as demise. I would describe bringing more choice, more competition, more consumer power into the NHS as a way of ensuring that the principles of the NHS survive in a world where voters and taxpayers expect much more accountability and responsiveness than the old service that there used to be, even when I first became MP, where you were expected to be grateful for getting an NHS service after you'd waited for a year or even 2 years in the waiting
But isn't that where you stand out really as an outlying maverick in the party? Liberal Democrats go on an awful lot about localism rather than individualism. It seems to be sort of, we want local government to make these decisions. The patient empowerment side of it is virtually non-existent in the Liberal Democrats' complaints. It's all local education authorities running things. It's just that we don't like the Whitehall and the Westminster bureaucrats because we don't get much of a slice of the action. But our local council base, that's pretty strong. It seems to still be, to my mind, a producer interest. Nobody's arguing for, let's say, a voucher system for education in the Liberal Democrats, as I understand it.
Well, let me make 2 points. Firstly, about the party position, and secondly, about the government's position. Or let me start with the government's position. When you talk about producer interests, one of my concerns about the current NHS bill, which shared by some of my colleagues, is that we need to involve people with expertise in the commissioning process in a sensible way. But actually, we need to be a little bit careful, for example, about giving too much power to GPs, who are, after all, professionals. They could be argued to be part of the producer interest. In some respects, they have been quite a conservative, small c, conservative influence in terms of reform of the NHS. In some parts of the country, they were the people in the last Parliament who fought the process of bringing in new choice into primary care provision because they didn't want their own practices to be threatened with competition. And so, as you know very well, a lot of the comments and concerns about the NHS bill were not just coming from the left of the political spectrum, they were also coming from all over the place, actually, and from the right as much as from the left. But you're right to say that there has been, in the past, a difference of emphasis in the Lib Dems between those people whose alternative to a sort of Brown-style approach in the public services relies very much on devolving power from Westminster to a local government level, and those people in the party who believe that empowering the consumers of public services, having more choice and competition, is an important part of getting the right answer as well. And it's not just one or two people who hold that view. I mean, our last health spokesman, Norman Lamb, was very passionately of that view. He had a lot of proposals in the manifesto which aimed to empower patients, not just those people delivering public services. But yeah, every political party has differences of views about major issues. Everyone is a coalition of some type, and yes, there are some differences.
And you don't share the sort of angst that, I mean, this was a very kind of Lib Dem style motion passed in the autumn of 2010. They didn't have the guts, the party conference, to go far enough to condemn Michael Gove's free schools policy. But they cited a willingness to accept the principle of free schools, but would not endorse their use personally or on a wide scale. It's almost impossible to imagine any political party on the planet other than the Liberal Democrats coming up with that form. You don't share the party's angst about the free schools programme as reflected in that conference motion from autumn 2010.
No, I mean, because because I take very serious the small L liberal approach, and if people want to set up schools which are open to everybody who are taxpayers, if they're not going to use mechanisms to make sure they're highly selective, if they bring more choice and diversity into the system, I think that's a good thing. And of course there are constraints. I mean, the government isn't offering a blank check to every single institution that wants to set up a free school because we haven't got that degree of finance. But in a free society, subject to those constraints, people should have that particular choice. I have to say, though, I mean, the Lib Dems have been willing to move on in some of the areas of public services where we used to be, I think, more cautious about reform. I mean, we have not in any way opposed, and we've agreed to the use of more sponsors within the school system. We have embraced sponsor-managed schools, as we call them when I was Lib Dem education spokesman, in which we bring new providers into the education system in order to improve the governance and leadership of schools, which is critical to improving educational standards. But actually, I do think that the right in politics that sometimes think that competition and choice are the only answers to all of our problems do need to learn and pay attention to some of the concerns that my colleagues would have, the pragmatic concerns, which say that competition isn't in all parts of the country going to necessarily solve all of the problems we've got in the public services, particularly where there isn't much competition at the moment. A lot of people don't shop around in health and education. A lot of people send their children to the local school because it is local, because they don't have to pay a bus fare, because their aspirations for education aren't very high, because there isn't another secondary school nearby. And I wouldn't want to rely only on competition and choice to deliver improvements in education in those areas if it meant that school children and parents had to wait 20 years to get a better quality of education. We've got to have accountability working well.
Let's look at whether the Liberal Democrats deserve to be called liberal on, if you like, everything else. And I think it probably is fair to say that on and I'm not quite sure how to make this distinction, but if you like, what I call Min Campbell civil liberties, judicial liberties, the right to, not to be detained without trial, the right to jury trial, opposition to identity cards, the Liberal Democrats have a fairly consistent and liberal history. But I'm interested in asking about some lifestyle liberties, and I'd like your view on whether the party and your parliamentary colleagues are nannying, liberal or confused. As you know, tobacco is a subject very close to my heart and very close to my lungs. Stephen Williams, MP, he's just down the road from you in Bristol West. He is in favour of plain packaging on cigarettes, a ban on smoking in cars, and a minimum pricing for units of alcohol. He's also in favour of state action to tackle obesity, but doesn't specify what that is. Willie Rennie, the new leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, has changed his mind, is now in favour of minimum pricing of alcohol. Ex-Member of Parliament Evan Harris has called for action to tackle the projection of women as sex objects, and the party conference has voted in favour of a ban on page 3 of The Sun. Sarah Tever, a government minister, has commissioned the chief executive of the Mothers Union to conduct a review of sexualised products aimed at children. Joe Swinson has called for an increase in the regulation of airbrushed images in women's magazines. I did ask Jo whether she thinks that if Star Wars is ever shown on television, it should begin with a government notice saying this movie doesn't feature real aliens, but she doesn't. Chris Huhne, in opposition, supported the Labour Party's decision to ban Dutch MP Geert Wilders from entering the country. Lynn Featherstone has called for an increase in the regulation of strip clubs and wants it to be harder for club owners to gain a licence. Can you tell me what level of liberalism you discern from your parliamentary colleagues' pronouncements on these matters?
Well, given that when I wrote the Orange Book, party policy was to ban the sale of goldfish at fun fairs, I think there's been quite a lot of improvement. And actually, one or two.
You've won that historic battle. I'll give you that one.
Actually, one or two of those things have been taken a bit out of context, and I feel that the party, in general, in all the conversations that I take part in the parliamentary party and most of the conferences, actually has flushed out quite a lot of the illiberalism that would sometimes make its way into party policy because of people wanting to be well-meaning rather than having the kind of liberal test of whether you could really justify intervention. I wish, to be honest, that when some of us stand up for people that want to smoke and do all these things, that those who want to have those freedoms would be a bit more robust. I mean, I remember when we debated these issues in Parliament, and I wanted the most liberal possible position on the smoking situation, to allow parts of clubs and pubs to be used for smoking purposes if they were a separate room and so forth. And I found actually that the weakest, most useless allies were the smokers and others, who actually were inclined to say, thank God you've banned this, it's made my life so much easier, I can now give up, I never had the self-control to do this otherwise. So I'd like a bit more consistency from those people who want their habits to be indulged as well.
Well, and what do you think on these sort of, protection of women? I mean, it seems to me there's an odd mix, which is a kind of what you might call a leftist liberal mix. I mean, the party, has just come out suggesting that we should move towards a decriminalisation or a liberalisation of drugs. Yet is extremely agitated about whether a supermodel appears in a magazine with a zit airbrushed from her face, or her waist made to look a bit thinner than it is.
You could take out of context one or two of these things.
I'm not taking Joe Swinson out of context.
If you look, if you can take out of context, if you look at all the liberal-illiberal debates that take place in the party, where we could get it right or get it wrong, you can always find some where a couple of us might feel that we've got it slightly wrong. But there are many other areas where it would have been very tempting for the party to be a liberal on actually, in some ways, bigger issues than these. For example, on candidate selection, where both of the other parties have been looking increasingly at ways to get more women or get more people from the ethnic minorities that all of us would like to see, and where the party has constantly been offered all women shortlists, all sorts of minority shortlists. And it has resisted that for the very liberal reason that giving that opportunity to one set of people would actually be to deny the freedoms of another set of people. And you can hear wonderfully liberal debates at the Lib Dem conference that I'm proud to listen to as a Lib Dem, because they are founded very much on small L liberal principles. So I think the party, you can always find some things that we might think kind of stray the wrong side of liberalism. Well, I think on the whole, over the last decade, we've actually moved to be much closer to our basic philosophical preference for giving people choice and freedom.
Well, let me move you to another area of another extremely popular area of Liberal Democrat policy, Europe.
Yeah.
What the hell is the Liberal Democrat policy on the European Union and the single currency?
Our position is a liberal one, a small L liberal one. I mean, if I can put it this way, by looking at the choices that the country has got at the moment, I think that we've got a debate at the moment on the EU where people feel that there are sort of three choices for Britain in the future. There is go into the Eurozone, which doesn't look particularly attractive at the moment. There is be on the periphery of the EU. And there is be out of the EU altogether and link up with Norway and Switzerland and a few other countries and see if we can survive outside the EU altogether. And the difficulty that Britain has got, if we reflect on it, is actually that the population and most of the political parties don't want any of those options. We don't want to be in the Eurozone because it looks a pretty awful place to be at the current time economically. We don't want to be on the fringes and on the periphery of the EU because most sensible people know that if we are, we'll find all the decisions being taken over time against our interests. And many of the things that the EU does are in areas where we would have to have some kind of international agreement, even if we were not members of the EU. And as to being, turning up to conferences with the Norwegian Prime Minister, whoever he is or she is, and the Swiss, I don't think we're very attracted to that either. So I think that there is a potential liberal consensus and also a consensus with our coalition partners that, for as far as the eye can see, we're not going to be in the euro, that we're going to be very tough on public spending in the EU and arguing for a more sensible, rational approach in the current era of austerity to EU spending, and that we want a more liberal European Union.
Which powers do you want repatriated from the EU to
Well,
the United
we've said,
Kingdom?
for example, that some of the social powers, we've talked in the coalition agreement about the Working Time Directive. We've had, I think, in our manifesto, things like the common fisheries policy, a whole series of areas where
But you think the Prime Minister should go and argue very firmly for repatriation of powers in whatever new treaty may
Well, hang on. I think that we ought to set out a very clear agenda for the type of European Union that we want to see in the future. I think that it should be a liberal European Union in which we seek to reinforce the job that the European Union is doing in those areas which clearly should be dealt with internationally, including opening up trade, where we have a very strong interest in doing so. We should try to keep the European Union out of unnecessary interference in national areas of policy making, where there really isn't a strong rationale for having policies which are consistently applied across the European Union. And then we've got to think about how we deliver in that policy area. And I think our big problem at the moment is that if we simply turn up in the EU in a time of huge economic crisis out there, waving a list of UK demands without probably any allies and without these demands being shared by anybody else, there are two risks. One is that we will simply get two fingers stuck up at us and we will achieve nothing. The other thing is that we will simply gain some small concessions, but at the cost of being pushed to the margin. We need to understand that there are many other nations within the EU, not just the new nations that have come in, but actually a lot of the existing core nations that are actually quite attracted to the vision that many people have in this country and in the Lib Dems and in some parts of the Conservative Party to have a much more liberal EU. But at the moment they see the United Kingdom as being a pretty toxic part of the debate in Europe, and not a country that people always want to be allied to, because not a country that's often seen to have a productive, constructive vision of where the EU goes. And that means that we are not in such a strong position to change, not just at the margin, the relationship between the UK and the EU, but the whole direction of the EU in the future. Okay. And I think that being in the EU, being major players, but playing a part in reforming the EU, a constructive part, a serious part, is exactly where the party needs to be and where the coalition needs to be delivering.
Let me just finish by asking you a bit about the prospects for the Lib Dems and for liberalism. I think a journalist I bumped in on the street the other day put this to me rather well. Said, I think the party you used to work for Mark's in a bit of a bind. Its proposition seems to be something like this. If you're in favour of the coalition, in favour of the European Union, in favour of immigration, in favour of the Human Rights Act, but hate the rich, you should vote Liberal Democrat. Given that seems to be the essential proposition of the party, is nothing short of a miracle that the Liberal Democrats are still at 9% in the opinion polls. But this is a pretty worrying time for the future sustainability of the Lib Dems, isn't it? Electoral reform is now not going to happen. A study, as you'll know, quoted very widely by Liberal Democrat spokespeople, shows that by UCL, showing that the Liberal Democrats have achieved 75% of their manifesto implemented by the coalition. Having implemented 75% of the manifesto, only 9% of the electorate want to vote for you. That's pretty bleak reading, isn't it? But presumably an impressive achievement with only 8.8% of your members of parliament. Why have more than half of the people who voted for you in the last general election deserted you when you've been so fantastically brilliant at delivery?
Well, let me try to put a slightly more optimistic gloss than you're putting on these things. And firstly, let me say that anybody who thinks that we're taken by surprise by being considerably lower in the opinion polls now than we were in May 2010 ought to rethink. I remember on the night that we signed off on the coalition agreement, Lib Dem MPs ecstatic at the idea we were going to be in government, people saying to Nick, will you be answering the questions at Prime Minister's questions when David Cameron's away, how wonderful this was, cheering and so forth. And Ming Campbell, who was sitting next to me for part of the meeting and who was not quite so enthusiastic about going into coalition with the Conservatives, I think it's fair to say, said under his breath something like, "They're cheering tonight, they'll be crying in the morning," that was a reflection on the ecstasy of going into government in comparison with the difficulties and the problems that they were going to be down the track. But I can assure you that none of the leadership of the party, from Nick Clegg downwards, ever thought that it was going to be easy in coalition, for two reasons. I mean, delivering firstly in this environment of austerity with massive public spending cuts was never going to be easy. But secondly, we know from all the experience on the continent that as soon as a smaller party goes into coalition, its identity for a period of time gets blurred, it goes down in the polls. I remember Chris Reynard faxing Paddy Ashdown urgently before he went for dinners with Tony Blair in the 1997-1998 period, saying, we've got to get this list of things if we go into coalition with Blair, because I predict that our opinion poll ratings will halve overnight if we go into coalition with Labour. And that was in the environment of the 97 Parliament, when the economic circumstances were much, much better. So if you're a third party and you go into coalition, A, in very tough economic times, and B, in a set of circumstances where you're always going to lose one set of voters for a period of time, the people who hated the coalition partner that you've had to get to go in with in the coalition, that there's going to be a group. What's suddenly going
to bring these people back? The miraculously optimistic growth forecasts for the next couple of years.
Two things. Firstly, us showing over the period of this Parliament that we were right to go into coalition, that we have made major advances in sorting out the economic mess that the country's in, and that we have helped to make the coalition fairer, more progressive, more liberal, and do more things that that a majority of the population want to see. And I think that even if you're finding it difficult to be positive and enthusiastic about each of the individual parties' programmes, let me invite you to look at it in a different way and think about the choices that people will have to make in 2015. Will they want the Labour Party back after the period of government which we're still recovering from in terms of the economy and some of the other problems? My gut instinct is no, that people are going to want the Labour Party out for a longer period of time, that Ed Miliband is not particularly being seen to deliver as leader, that the economic programme of the Labour Party isn't yet credible. Are people yet going to want a majority Conservative government? I don't think that they necessarily are, and I don't think that they are necessarily going to think that the government would have been better or fairer or more liberal or closer to the centre of gravity of the public opinion had the Conservatives been.
But this is going to be your problem at the next elections. I mean, you can kiss goodbye to equidistance. There's no way, having spent 5 years screaming at the Labour front bench across the dispatch box about how terrible they are and praising George Osborne and David Cameron for how marvellous they are, that you can go into the next election and say, well, it's the devil in the deep blue sea. The Liberal Democrats will be seen as being much more closer to the Conservatives and will surely have to effectively run on a coalition ticket. I mean, the deficit reduction strategy, the behaviour of this government, you will have had to have defended over its 5-year record, and the Conservative Party will be in the same position.
We won't be divorcing ourselves from the last 4 or 5 years, from the 4 or 5 years of coalition. We'll have to stand by our record, and people will expect us to do so. But both ourselves and the Conservatives will have competing visions of the future, which will be different. We will be competing with the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and we will have, I imagine, exactly the same position that we went into the last general election with. which is that there will be competition between the three parties on what their manifestos are. People will vote based upon which party's manifesto they support. The parties will then have to look at the results and work depending upon the results delivered by the electorate.
And do you think Nick
And
Clegg...
we have to go in as an independent party.
And do you think Nick Clegg will lead the party in 2015?
I am 100% sure that he will, yeah.
You've always said previously, David, that you wouldn't consider yourself as a future leader of the Liberal Democrats. Are you going to delight your friends and allies by saying you're actually reconsidering that?
No, I'm certainly not. I think that we've got an excellent leader, and I think that I'm far better beavering away on the minutiae behind the scenes and not trying to do things that I'm not qualified to do.
Well, David, in the answers that you've given, you've, I think, persuaded me and possibly some of the audience that the Liberal Democrats are maybe not so much a broad church as a cathedral. But it's encouraging that there is some relatively free market analysis still at the heart of the party, and we wish you a speedy return, I think, to government. A lot of people said you were made for the job of Chief Secretary of the Treasury. You may have only done it for 18 days, but are still famous for it, and we wish you every success in trying to move the Liberal Democrats in a very liberal direction. Thanks very much for your candid answers and dealing with all of the questions that I've put to you and some members of our audience, and I wonder if we can thank Right Honourable David Laws, Liberal Member for Yeovil, in the normal way. Thanks very much.